welcome everybody to this evening's webinar, which could not be more important because the title of our webinar is Step Back from the Brink, Ukraine, NATO and Trump. And these three things combined, even just a week before Christmas, in a world which is incredibly complicated and incredibly dangerous in a whole number of respects, this particular topic, I think, is of particular concern and of particular interest. And it's vitally important that we address it because the ongoing situation in Ukraine is of the utmost seriousness, not least because of the wider threats and the developing threats that everything in Ukraine and the process unfolding there represents. It continues to have serious implications. Yes, in Ukraine itself. Yes, because of the situation there on the ground, but also more widely in Europe and in Britain. And the core of that concern, the core of the risks and the factors that we have to confront is that there has been an extreme military escalation revolving around that situation in Ukraine, and that manifests itself in a whole number of ways which have both immediate and which will also have longer and medium term consequences. That would have been the case regardless of the outcome of the US presidential elections. But to my mind, and our speakers will address this in further detail, to my mind, the victory of Donald Trump threatens even greater instability than the sort of instability that an ongoing Kamala Harris presidency would have represented. So it's brilliant and a testament to the strength of the movement in Britain and further afield that we have such an experienced international panel of speakers here this evening who will give more of an in-depth analysis of what is going on, what all this means, what Ukraine, NATO's role in it, and the new and upcoming Trump presidency represents. And let's hope, and I'm pretty certain that we will have, an acute and focused analysis of the potential developments that face us in 2025, but more importantly, an analysis of how we could and should respond to the escalating risks that we face. So we have four brilliant speakers this evening. Our first speaker tonight will be Wright. She's a long-standing peace activist. She has the distinction of being a former US colonel and also a former US diplomat. She resigned from the US government in 2003 in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq. Our second speaker will be Sevim Dağdelen. Sevim has been a member of the German Bundestag, the German government, since 2005 and has a huge amount of experience of dealing with what is going on in the German and wider European context, but also a more international view. And one of her distinctions is that this year she published a book, NATO, A Reckoning with the Atlantic Alliance. So we'll look forward to hearing from Sevim. Our third speaker will be Lindsey. She's an author, one of the founders of the Stop the War Coalition, which was formed in 2001 out of opposition to the US-led war on terror. And Lindsey's role in the anti-war and peace movements over the last 2 decades or more, and even longer, to my mind, has been indispensable. And our fourth speaker this evening is Sophie, who's the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and she herself is a long-standing peace activist. So I'll hand over, first of all, to Anne. Welcome, Anne.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be with you all. And, you know, who knows what's going to happen with Trump being elected. We are all kind of awaiting what may transpire because of what we saw from his first presidency. I will mention that everyone of note in the U.S. seems to be sucking up to Trump right now. I guess they figure, well, he's going to be in for the next 4 years, so we have to do the best we can. And the Secretary General of NATO is actually he's saying the President-elect Trump demonstrated strong U.S. leadership throughout his first term in office, a term that turned the tide on European defense spending, improved transatlantic burden sharing, and strengthened alliance capabilities. And when he takes office on January 20th, he'll be welcomed by a stronger, larger, and more united alliance. 2/3 of allies now spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense, and defense spending and production are on an upward trajectory across the alliance, which I think for us peace activists say, well, more war. And that's one of the things that we are hoping that President Trump will try to do what he says he is going to do, is to try to work for peace on the Russia-Ukraine issue. We certainly hope he does, because the massive killings that are happening on both sides of the conflict are something that just cannot go on. And his blustery, though, I know Putin, I know him so well, I'm going to be able to do this, that, and all. It makes us all wonder. But I, for one, certainly hope he is able to bring the two sides together so that there can be an end to the killing there. Now, whether or not that happens, we will see, and it's going to be a part of his whole administration, which I'll go into that a little bit here. The people that he's appointed into his administration don't give me the greatest sense of solidarity, I guess. The person who has been named to be the U.S. ambassador to NATO is a guy by the name of Matthew Whitaker, who in the first Trump administration was a deputy attorney general from 2017 to 2021. And then he went into the Trump First Policy Institute think tank. So to my knowledge, he does not have any NATO experience or international experience. That was not part of his work in the Justice Department. Then as Secretary of State, we have Marco Rubio, a Florida senator, who Trump, during the 2016 campaign, when Rubio was an opponent for the nomination, Trump ridiculed him as little Marco. Marco Rubio has only the international experience of being in the U.S. Senate. As the UN ambassador, we have a woman by the name of Elise Stefanik, who has been in the U.S. House of Representatives for 4 years and is a person who has been a Trump loyalist. In fact, all of these people are loyalists. Most of them have come out to say that the 2020 election was stolen. So he's appointing people that really have no experience in the places that he's putting them. The only experience is the loyalty to him. And then, of course, as Defense Secretary is Pete Hegseth, who's a former Fox News host and veteran, military veteran, but the allegations of massive use of alcohol, womanizing, sexual assault, and mismanagement of even the very small organizations, veterans support organizations that he headed, all of them went bankrupt. So this is the team that Trump has put together for his administration. So it's going to be quite a ride for us all, both internationally and then domestically, where that's where I think a lot of activists here in the U.S. are really focusing attention because of the probability of the slashing of domestic social justice, social fabric issues are. So the Ukraine situation, we hope that he can resolve that. And I'll just mention one other thing, that on the other major conflict going on right now, which is the Israeli genocide of Gaza, Trump is, and to which Germany and the United States are the primary weapons providers to the Israeli government for the continued genocide in Gaza. for the destruction of the West Bank, for the destruction of the southern part of Lebanon, and now for Syria. What's all the things that are going on in Syria. So the probability that Trump will continue what Biden has started, which is the total impunity for Israel to do whatever it wants to. Sadly, we are thinking that Trump, because of his loyalty toward Netanyahu and the state of Israel, he will continue that, much to the horror of all of us as we see the destruction going on there. So we predict that the weapons from the United States will continue to go into Israel for the destruction of Gaza. But the one hope is that Trump will halt the weapons that go into Ukraine, which can put pressure on at least the Ukraine side to come to a negotiation table. Right now, the Biden administration is surging more and more military equipment into Ukraine, with thinking that the probability is that Trump will stop those weapons transfers. So we look at a kind of a horrific situation, I think, for us in the world of war. It's a horrific thing that we're facing, and I'm out here in the Pacific right now at home in Hawaii, and we're looking toward Asia and the Pacific with North Korea, China, and the United States, all nuclear powers. And I'll just mention one very interesting thing that's happened out here. You know, both North Korea and China have sent missiles, tested missiles, and have tested the missiles, and they've gone into the Pacific Ocean. Well, the United States, just in this last month, has created a new type of ICBM launch capability. And that's by putting an ICBM on a parachute and putting the missile inside a C-17 Air Force transport plane, taking it up to 20,000 feet or higher, and then letting it fall down by parachute, and then igniting the missile, launching the missile by parachute. And then the tiny island of Guam, the U.S. territory of Guam, which is now being outfitted with extraordinary missile interceptor capability. They're now testing those interceptors on this parachute-launched, nuclear-capable ICBM missile. So when we look to Europe and what you all are facing over in Europe, I mean, some of the stuff that we're facing here in the Pacific is pretty scary too. So with that, I will stop my presentation, but wish us luck with our new president of the United States. Thank you.
Huge thanks to Anne for that contribution. And let's face it, none of us can exactly predict what a Trump presidency, a new second Trump presidency, 1 month or less from now, will present. But I'm very clear, and I think the movements in this country are very, very clear, that people like Anne and the other peace and anti-war organizations and solidarity organizations in the United States will play a vital role in what comes next. And I'll just say to Anne and to everybody else here that should you need us, should you need our help and support, it is here. And let's hope we see you very, very soon to analyze the opening days of the second Trump presidency and whatever horrors, and I think it might well be horrors on a number of levels, whatever horrors it presents. So from the United States, which has a whole host of responsibilities, problems, and upcoming uncertain dynamics, to Germany. And we have Sevim Dağdelen as our next speaker. And I want to make very, very clear that the situation for peace and anti-war, and particularly for those in Germany who oppose NATO and at the same time stand in steadfast solidarity with the people of Palestine as they're subjected to Israel's genocide, is very, very difficult indeed. But Sevim and her comrades have been a signal voice in Germany, to my mind, standing for the sorts of things that we believe in. And on a personal level, I hope very, very much that when a change of government comes, in the early new year in Germany that Sevim and very, very many people like her find a voice in the Bundestag, the German parliament, to stand and fight for our cause. So with honor and with gratitude, it's over to Sevim Dağdelen. Thank you, Sevim. Well, I think you need to unmute, Sevim.
Thank you so much, Tom. Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this very urgent but very, very important webinar. I just want to make sure that everyone knows who I am. I'm a member of the German parliament. I'm in the opposition. I'm the spokesperson for foreign affairs and international relations for the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance. It's a new party we have built just in January, and we are heading now to the general elections, the snap elections on 23rd of February. We are the only party in the German parliament who is in favor of an arms embargo to Israel, for example, and always against the weapon deliveries to Ukraine. We have been and in favor of negotiations and peace talks. Unfortunately, I can't stay till the end of this very important webinar because we do have session week in the parliament at the moment, and I have a lot of more meetings I have to attend, so I just want to apologize for that in advance. If we want to talk about what Donald Trump will mean for global conflict with the times as they are, we first need to talk about what deselected US President Joe Biden means right now for global conflict and an appalling degree of escalation. A note on Syria. Dividing Syria into US, Israeli, and Turkish zones of influence while supporting the seizure of power of Islamist jihadist group is part of a policy of global escalation with which the United States is attempting to secure global influence at others' expense. So it certainly has nothing at all to do with freedom and democracy. On the contrary, actually, it threatens to create a Mediterranean Afghanistan with serious long-term consequences for the security of societies in Europe and elsewhere. And in Ukraine, in Ukraine, the outgoing Biden administration of Democrats is risking nothing less than World War III. So together with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and France's has-been President Emmanuel Macron, who follow the deselected US president like lapdogs, it is prepared to put everything on the line in the lost proxy war in Ukraine. Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, and Emmanuel Macron are irresponsible warmongers, putting the security of the public in the balance in a bid to avoid the defeat of the NATO in Ukraine after all. The decision to give Ukraine leave to attack using US long-range weapons and British and French long-range weapons threatens to be interpreted by Russia as Britain and the United States entering the war. So Russia's President Vladimir Putin has announced lately that Russian intermediate range missiles will be fired in response, though it is unclear whether this will also encompass arms factories and military bases on NATO territory. And the irresponsible release of US, British, and French missiles, which are being fired on Russia by NATO troops, must be stopped immediately to prevent a third World War. We must put a spanner on Biden's and Starmer's work, and we are in a situation that is far more dangerous than the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. And when I hear now that NATO voices are relying on Russia not following through on its announcement or retaliation and declaring that Russia's President Vladimir Putin is only bluffing, it is really exactly that kind of mentality which sleepwalks into major war. Meanwhile, as Anne mentioned, the new General Secretary of NATO, Mark Rutte, the Dutch guy, is supporting the strategy of escalation in Ukraine. Rutte said just recently, I quote, "We are going to need a lot more than 2%. But let me be very frank. If you would only spend more and not spend better, you have to go to at least 4%, quote end." So to achieve that, the plan is to cut the welfare spending. And I mean, we already spent 90 billion per year. This is 2% in Germany. And to spend more than that means like 4%. That would mean about 180 billion. This is half of the budget of the German, the Federal Republic of German, for example. So this is the problem we are facing at the moment. And now to Trump. I mean, this is the NATO as that would also make NATO as an instrument of social warfare against its members' own populations, as well as an organization preparing for war with Russia and China. And the NATO countries together already spent around 1.3 trillion US dollars on armaments and their armed forces. And now to Trump. So Donald Trump's elections victory lays bare the serious crisis in which US society finds itself. Life expectancy in the United States has gone down in recent years for about 2 years, for example. The country is significantly behind the development of other industrialized nations in that respect. Child mortality in the United States is at a record high for an industrialized country. And by contrast, arms spending and new borrowing are at unprecedented levels, and we are experiencing the fall of a hegemon, which in the proxy war in Ukraine currently seems to be trying to stake its hopes on absolute escalation to resist the safe downfall it sees coming. So looking at the way deselected US President Joe Biden is drastically increasing the danger of war by releasing US long-range weapons for Zelensky's attacks on Russia, one has to hope that Trump will keep his promise to end the Ukrainian war quickly and so avert the absolute escalation that Washington is steering towards. And at the moment, Biden and NATO are conjuring a crisis that far exceeds the dangers of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as I said. So if Russia makes good on its intention to strike back with intermediate range missiles, we will be in a major war in Europe, on the European continent. So everything we have heard about Ukraine from Donald Trump so far, however, can give us cause for hope. Trump has warned against further escalation in Ukraine and severely criticized the Biden administration's decision to supply US long-range weapons to Ukraine, though without putting forward any concrete proposals himself so far. That's something we have to consider. So Trump's special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, is working on a ceasefire. An agreement may emerge, which includes a refusal of NATO membership for Ukraine, as well as an immediate ceasefire. But they are dangerous uncertainties with Donald Trump too. Donald Trump's team is mixed or very diverse, I would say. It concludes neoconservatives like the designated Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who was still likening Trump to a third world dictator during the 2016 elections, and has criticized him for his policy on Russia. And I have to I have to add, he's on the sanction list by China. So the scenario emerging in the key posts is more like this. Trump could be the man who helps end, to at least freeze, wars like the one in Ukraine, but only so that he can pursue a strategy of US confrontation and limitation towards Latin America and the Middle East, and all the more aggressively, we have to say. And in that view, the European NATO members to deal with Russia so as to free up resources for the United States at the fronts described. And China appears in this scenario as, on the one hand, the declared main adversary, and on the other hand, there are reports suggesting that Donald Trump would offer China a G2 format, in part to diffuse conflicts together. I mean, I wish the last thing would happen. And Trump could try to end the United States and NATO's proxy war in Ukraine, not least because the insight is spreading that the realities of war cannot be changed by the use of miracle weapons. Like, for example, they are discussing the German missiles, Taurus, as a miracle weapon. If we sent that to Ukraine, it would be a game changer, because the reach out of these German missiles, the Taurus, are 500 kilometers, so way more than the French, the British, and the US. And but it would reach then, of course, from Ukraine, the Moscow or St. Petersburg. So Russia, but at the end, everyone, all the experts, they say Russia will win this war, but at the same time, it will set in motion a huge increase in arms spending, so that it can keep the upper hand in the medium and long term. And the only possible aim for the peace movement is to resist. Social justice and peace are directly linked to these war policies. Once the war in Ukraine has come to an end, the objective must be close relations with Russia. Europe needs Russia, and Russia needs Europe, and Russia is part of Europe. So security is only possible on the European continent with Russia, not against Russia, not without Russia. Security is only possible together. This is our point of view, and I hope you could all keep up the fight with us to secure freedom and peace on the European continent.
Huge thanks to Sevim for that intervention. We've had two contributions from international speakers so far, and one of the real strengths of the peace and anti-war movements is that we are an international movement, and we link what is happening in the United Kingdom and in terms of the relationships that the UK directly maintains with struggles and priorities and movements across the world. So thank you to both Anne and Sevim for their contributions. We will be using the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen if you tap or move your mouse. So please do type your questions in there. There will be plenty of time to respond whilst we listen to and to ask questions whilst we listen to our next two speakers, the next of whom is Lindsey German, who I've already introduced. But it's worth emphasising the essential role that Lindsey has played in the anti-war and peace movements more generally over the past 2 decades, and for much longer than that. And the level of analysis, but more importantly, the level of unity that Lindsey's arguments have been able to achieve, have been an indispensable element in the strength of our movement in this country. So I'll hand over to you, Lindsey, and thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thanks for inviting me. And it's a real pleasure to be on the panel with Anne and Sevim, and of course Sophie as well, because I think the need for this kind of discussion and this sort of debate about what is going on is really, really vital. And we are, as I think all of us on this panel will acknowledge, we're in probably the most dangerous time certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and perhaps you can go back even further, back towards the beginning of the Cold War or the end of the during the Second World War. So I think this is a very serious situation that we have. It's one where we have Trump clearly elected as president of the United States, with all that entails. And obviously we're talking about war and peace tonight, but there are a whole number of other policies that I think many of us would object to, particularly his racial attitudes towards Muslims in particular, and the Islamophobia, which wasn't invented by Trump, but has been part of the development of Western politics, especially since the War on Terror, which began in 2001. As Sevim has said quite rightly, I think we should have absolutely no illusions about the role of the Biden government and what it has done, because Biden has been absolutely committed both to the war in Ukraine and what that means in terms of the sheer scale of the weapons that are going to Ukraine, but also the big increase in arms spending worldwide, which this has been a major contribution to. But of course, Biden has also been somebody who has supported Israel and Netanyahu's policies right up to the hilt, and who continues to do so. Every single red line that Biden said he had over Israel's treatment of the people of Gaza and the people of West Bank, every single one of those has been crossed. If you look at the Amnesty International report, which came out a week or two ago, it is absolutely scathing about the role of Israel. And that means that our government here in Britain, with Keir Starmer, who is essentially following the same policy, perhaps even with more enthusiasm than the previous Tory governments that we had, but also with Biden, these are people who are directly facilitating and complicit in what is going on in Gaza. And the fact that Netanyahu and his former defense minister Yoav Gallant have both been issued with warrants for their arrest as a result of war crimes tells you what a bad state we were in. And this is even before we talk about the growing militarization of the Pacific, the AUKUS Pact, all the other, the rearming of Japan, which is a major issue in the Pacific. All of these, I think, are things that we have to bring all of them together in understanding they're not separate issues. They're very, very much linked, and they're very, very much connected to a declining American imperialism, which is faced with threats most obviously from China in terms of its economic standing, and which wants to maintain its position and has to maintain its position by increasing belligerence, increasing militarism, and this is the prop that it needs in order to maintain its world leadership, if you like, of economically and military around the world. So this is the situation we're in. If you look at Ukraine, this is the flashpoint of the most dangerous part of these wars, or the most immediate flashpoint, because you have the use of the Storm Shadow missiles, which were the British and French missiles, which are being used directly in Russian territory. You have the US missiles, the ATACMS, which are being used in Russian territory. Now, these are missiles permitted and facilitated by nuclear powers, by Britain and France and the United States, against another nuclear power. And you don't have to be a genius to work out the real possibility of this escalating in the way that the previous speakers have talked about. And I think that particularly being here in Britain, we have to pay a lot of attention to what Keir Starmer and his absolutely useless Foreign Secretary David Lammy are doing, because they are the cheerleaders of this escalation. They are the people who put a lot of pressure on the United States in order to do it, and they are the people who are saying Starmer went to France to meet with Macron on the anniversary of the First World War on the 11th of November, and they were totally committed to being in this right to the very end. We will be with Ukraine as long as it takes. And they fear that Trump will have a rapid settlement, which is what Trump has said that he wants to do. And this is something that the European powers, I think the way in which they react to this is to spend more money on arms, to accelerate the idea of greater arms spending, and to, in particular, have created a situation where in Germany, the arms spending is completely changed in terms of being a relatively low figure for a major NATO power, to now being committed to being the biggest spender in Europe. This is an honor, if you want to call it that the United Kingdom has at the moment. Germany will overtake that, but of course the United Kingdom will try to keep up as well, because it doesn't want to lose its place in terms of its standing as a nuclear power, in terms of its position on the UN Security Council, the Permanent Council. So those are all major problems for us. And I think when we look at the European powers, there's political crisis in Germany, which obviously Sevim is right in the middle of at the moment. There's political crisis in France, which can't form a stable government, and where Macron is in very isolated minority in terms of both to the right and to the left. And in Britain, despite the fact that Labour won with a very big majority only 6 months ago, its standing in the polls was low. The vote that it got was very, very low, but its standing in the polls is getting lower and lower every week. What do they all do in response to this? They will turn to banging the drum, they will turn towards more militarism, they will turn towards all these sorts of things. And I think it's particularly dangerous for us because we know that these wars that they're talking about, we know firstly that everything we have said about the war on terror has turned out to be true, whether Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, all of those places, the disastrousness of intervention. But we also know that in Ukraine and in the Middle East, that the dangers of escalation are very, very real. And I think particularly in Ukraine, you've got a war which is being lost. Let's be absolutely honest about this. Ukraine is losing the war and is losing it badly. It's losing it militarily. It's also losing it politically, in terms of there's growing numbers of desertions from the army in Ukraine. There is growing discontent among the Ukrainian people with the war continuing. There are more and more people who want a settlement, and even Zelensky has said he wants a settlement if we can get one which allows them to be in NATO, which, by the way, isn't going to happen. But this is the kind of way that they're talking. So what's happening is, effectively, the various powers are prolonging the war for as long as possible, even though they know that talks are on the horizon over the next few months. But they're prolonging it for as long as possible in order to get the greatest political and military advantage for their particular side in it. And it's a horrible, horrible situation. I think we should be aware that any peace that takes place in Ukraine will not be a conclusive or a safe, a stable peace. It will be a very, very dangerous peace in all sorts of ways. It will mean the acceptance of Russia taking some of the territory that it already occupies, but it will be a peace where effectively there'll be a kind of partition, and effectively on both sides there will be huge numbers of troops. There will be constant tension, and it will get, if anything, worse. In Gaza, the situation is even more desperate for people, because genocide and war crimes are committed on a daily basis in Gaza. And there, again, any kind of talk of peace, and Trump is, if anything, worse than Biden on this. I mean, Anne made the point about the people he's appointing to direct his foreign policy. Let's remember the man that's being appointed to be the ambassador to Israel is a man who does not even accept that the West Bank should be called the West Bank. In other words, they don't accept the whole idea that Israel shouldn't be in the occupied territories. In fact, they want the illegal settlements to continue in these areas and all the other things that that will entail. So very, very dangerous and fragile situation. What is it? Just one final point I wanted to bring into this equation is the arms spending. We've got a new arms race, and it's a terrifying prospect. $2.4 billion trillion dollars a year are spent on arms worldwide. And, you know, this involves, obviously, the United States is by far the biggest. China is the next. Russia is obviously a major arms spender. So is India, Britain, Saudi Arabia. These are the top few, but you've got all sorts of other countries that are vying for the position of, for whatever reason, wanting to have more arms. Now, we know before 1914, the arms race then didn't result in peace, it resulted in war. We know the arms build-up in the 1930s didn't result in peace, it resulted in war. And I think we have to be extremely skeptical about what it means when people say it's about security and defense and all these things. It is about nothing of the sort. It's about making the world a much, much more dangerous place. So I suppose, what can we do about it? Well, I think one of the things we have to do is that we have to try to build from the Palestine solidarity movement, which has been a big movement and is a big movement in this country, to make people aware of not just the situation in Palestine, not just in the Middle East, but how imperialism is creating these conflicts around the world, and that we are moving towards these kind of things. So it's about confronting the possibility of war in Ukraine with China, and obviously the wider war in the Middle East, which is well underway with the different powers intervening in Syria, which is you know, is an incredibly fragmented state, and I think will remain a fragmented state, not least because that will suit the regional and the world powers to do it. So this is one thing we need to do. I think we also have to link the issues. Sevim talked about it was 3% of GDP that NATO is heading towards. That's a hell of a lot of money. And they really want 4 or 5% of GDP. What does this mean for working people around Europe, in the United States, and all the other places where people will be under pressure to do this? You're talking about austerity at home, and we've seen this with the attacks on the women pensioners this week. We've seen it with the attacks on the pensioners' fuel allowance, on the benefits cap for people who have more than 2 children. The housing crisis, all this will get much, much worse. At the same time, austerity at home and war abroad. This is what we are facing. So a big challenge for us, but it's a challenge, I think, that we do make a difference. We have made a difference over Gaza. We do make a difference over developing an anti-war perspective, which millions of people will agree with. And I think both from the point of view of Stop the War and from CND, and obviously from our friends and comrades internationally, we have to increase this organisation and do much, much more to face up to the challenges which lie ahead in the new year. Thank you.
Huge thanks, Lindsey, for that important and vital analysis, and for that closing message, which is a very important contribution to the discussion we're having tonight. Just a reminder to those of you who are online, we are taking questions and points in the Q&A function. We've had several, many of which focus on the question of what do we do and how do we do it. But before we get to the Q&A and contribution section, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Sophie Bolt. We're in a time of war, genocide, and acute nuclear risks, and I, for one, as chair of CND, am very pleased, and it massively boosts my confidence to be able to confront all of these issues alongside Sophie, who's our new General Secretary. So over to you, Sophie, and thanks very much.
Thank you. And it's really amazing to be on a platform with such powerful and inspiring women. So thank you very much, Anne, Lindsey, and I know Sevim's had to go now, but really, really great. And as people have said, it's a very, very serious time that we're facing, and that's why we organised this webinar, you know, to sort of have this kind of conversation and keep this discussion going. And certainly, as we've seen in the last month, you know, there's been this incredibly serious escalation in the conflict in Ukraine, you know, precipitated by Trump's election. Biden chose to massively escalate the conflict, and the new British government, you know, as a key US ally, has been the most aggressive NATO member in backing that escalation. And just last week, Ukraine yet again attacked Russia with, this time, 6 of the US-made ATACMS long-range missiles, hitting a military airfield on the Azov Sea. And this follows, as people have said, the use of both US and UK-made long-range missiles by Ukraine. You know, these missiles can only be targeted by US GPS technology. So this means that the US is decisively participating in the conflict. That's part of the reason why their use has been so significant. And we've seen in retaliation, Russia launched its intermediate range hypersonic missile, the Orezhnik. And Russia also ratified the change in its nuclear use policy. And this was done directly in response to the use of British and US long-range missiles. The policy now states it may use its nuclear weapons against conventional attacks as opposed to nuclear attacks by a non-nuclear state if it is backed by nuclear states. So that's basically NATO backing Ukraine. And just on Monday, Russia confirmed that it will keep its, as it calls, non-strategic nuclear forces on constant combat alert. And it warned it could increase production of these hypersonic Orezhnik missiles if there are developments by the US of more short and medium range missiles in Europe and in Asia. Now, you know, Biden had previously refused to allow Ukraine to attack Russian territory with these missiles precisely because it could draw NATO into an all-out confrontation with Russia. But both Biden and Starmer gave the go-ahead, knowing full well that Russia was planning to lower its nuclear threshold in response. So these decisions, you know, are utterly, utterly reckless and put at risk the lives of Ukrainian people, Russian people, you know, European people, as well as people in Britain. And they're also especially reckless given that the military experts and diplomats across the political spectrum, including Ukraine, have made it clear that the use of these long-range weapons won't make a decisive difference to the outcome of the war. So we know, for instance, you know, reports that Ukraine, you know, has lost now 40% of the territory that it gained in its offensive in Kursk in the summer. So, you know, what's the sort of the military, you know, reason for this? You know, what's the purpose of it? And it does feel like, you know, that the military policy is sort of being driven by internal US politics, you know, with sort of Biden trying to sort of secure a more favorable situation for Ukraine going into talks. But I mean, I suppose I don't, you know, I don't feel maybe that sort of confident that Trump will even be able to secure a political settlement. I mean, there's no guarantee, is there? But it could also be that Biden's actually just trying to stop a Ukrainian, you know, military defeat. You know, people were saying like Ukraine is losing this. So, you know, is he's wanting to stop that defeat, be on his watch and push it over to Trump. But either way, you know, it's sort of US sort of domestic politics that kind of driving this, not the interests of the Ukrainian people. And certainly there's sort of no sign of Trump pulling out of NATO, as has been warned by NATO hawks. In fact, you know, it was Trump that had been consistently pushing for NATO states to spend between 3 to 4% of defense spending. And certainly, I mean, I would suggest that the approach by Trump, given his America First policy, will be for Europe to take on much more of the economic burden of projecting US military and nuclear power. And that's, you know, I think that's what we're seeing. Certainly, you know, last week, the NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte told NATO members to turbocharge their defense spending to 3% of GDP. And I think that, you know, we need to look at that in terms of the scale of NATO spending already, you know, especially that of its biggest spender, the US. If we look at like spending on nuclear weapons compared to other countries, so according to ICANN, the US spent $51.5 billion on nuclear weapons in 2023. That is more than all the other nuclear armed countries put together, and accounts for 80% of the increase in nuclear weapon spending in 2023. So, like, you know, absolutely sort of vast scale in comparison to other nuclear states. Looking at military spending by NATO states. So despite this increase in military spending by Russia, which is they've increased their military spending by 24% in 2023, the total NATO spending is still 12 times that size. So, you know, these calls by Mark Rutte and NATO hawks to drive military spending is obviously part of a much wider global war drive, and this drive for militarism of our societies and economies that have been referenced here by Lindsey and others. But obviously, like, you know, given the US is the dominant military power in NATO, it is a war drive that is being led by and for the interests of the US. And certainly, you know, if we look at it in terms of its nuclear capability, backed by this colossal level of spending, the US has been developing, you know, a whole new generation of nuclear weapons for nearly a decade. So in 2016, under Obama's administration, it developed these B-6112 satellite-guided nuclear bombs to be stationed at NATO bases across Europe. In the summer of 2021, the US had its first flight test of these bombs on one of these F-35A fighter jets. And then since then, these nuclear capable jets have been delivered to NATO bases across Europe, and they came to Britain in December 2021. And at the same time, as part of a multi-million-dollar upgrade, these bases have been prepared to take on the delivery of these new nuclear bombs, and that's scheduled for spring next year. And alongside these developments, the US and Britain continue to aggressively promote NATO expansion and, of course, membership for Ukraine. So these developments by the US and NATO over the last decade, as we have seen, have hugely been really destabilizing and have had a really significant impact and massively contributed to the terrible conflict in Ukraine today. And these latest decisions by the US and Britain to allow Ukraine to use these long-range missiles has shown how quickly the situation can escalate and threaten nuclear confrontation. And that's why C&D is calling on political leaders to step back from the nuclear brink, and for the British government to withdraw the Storm Shadow missiles from Ukraine. And it's why we will be exposing the lies behind the British government's new industrial defence strategy, which seeks to justify even more billions being sunk into war and nuclear weapons, which tries to present the militarization of our societies and our economies as something beneficial to our populations. So something that is more beneficial than alleviating child poverty, halting pensioner winter deaths, and scaling up investment in renewables. But, you know, we all know you can't build sustainable growth on genocide, global militarism, and the threat of nuclear war. So for those people out there who are not already involved in the peace movement, involved in the anti-war movement, please get involved. You know, we're working with students, trade unions, climate activists to halt this growing threat of nuclear weapons and this huge attempt to try and militarize our societies. We are part of this broad alliance, Together Against Trump, that's going to be protesting his inauguration on the 20th of January. And just as Lindsey said, you know, more and more we are seeing the interconnectedness of our issues around climate change, global justice, you know, fighting the rise of the far right. They're all totally interconnected with the movement against war and against nuclear weapons. And finally, I'd say that we have to take inspiration from the states and the populations in the global south who are really leading this movement for peace, for a nuclear-free world, and for a new world order that's about global cooperation, for peace, for respecting international law and human life. So it's really important, again, that we also link up with those movements to help strengthen and inspire us going forward. Thanks.
Huge thank you to Sophie and to all of our other speakers. A number of questions have come into the Q&A function. Please do keep sending them in. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative of paraphrasing, excuse me, and grouping some of these questions together. I'll take them in twos to begin with. And it's worth noting that the majority of the questions posted in the chat relate directly to our tactics and our strategy as an anti-war and a peace and a disarmament movement, both in the UK and more widely. So I'll put these questions out there in my paraphrased fashion, and I'll take the speakers in order that they spoke. Sevim has had to leave. She had pressing commitments in the German Parliament to attend to, but I'll take responses in the order that the speakers contributed first off. So our first pair of questions, excuse me, the first is from Andrew Lohman, who asked, should we simply consider ending wars and not get uptight about who is going to do it? And I'm pairing that with a question from Linda Pence Gunter, who asks, isn't it disingenuous at best to hope or believe that Trump will do anything positive in the interests of peace? So over to Anne first on that question, or those two questions.
Well, they're very good questions. Yes, I think our ultimate goal is elimination of war, but how we get to it is the big challenge. And the challenge that we have is trying to get our political parties, no matter who is elected here in the United States, they're all warmongers. They all, get paid off by the weapons manufacturers during their campaigns, and we really have very, very few peace candidates that have actually won elective office, which may indicate also that the electorate is not opposed to war until their kids are the ones that are chosen to go fight a war that they don't even understand where the country is, where they're gonna go, and what they're gonna do. So it's the continuing challenge of getting the people of our countries to rise up to say, the war is not the answer, that we've got to have diplomacy, that we want our politicians and our diplomats to use diplomacy to resolve issues. And at this stage, we're not having any luck on it. So we have to keep after it. We have to keep going on it. And right now, we face in the United States, we face Trump, who I'm not as negative, although I certainly didn't vote for him. But when he was in his first administration, about the only good thing I could say was that he actually did meet with potential enemies. I mean, he met with Kim Jong-un, although I think it was his advisors that kept him from signing some sort of a armistice, a peace agreement, or something like that. He's already reached out to the head of China to say, you're welcome to come, please come to my inauguration. Which is, what do you believe, whether we're going to keep the tariffs on China, but come on and come to the inauguration? But at least he's kind of talking to people, whereas Biden actually, has stiffed the world on this. It's like my way or the highway. We continue to support the state of Israel. We continue to flood Ukraine with weapons. So I certainly am willing to give Trump a benefit of the doubt. I mean, that's the only hope we have. We've seen what the Democrats have done with continually just fueling these wars. So we have to keep after it. And one of the questions I think I saw in the chat that I'll mention also, how do we mobilize our own people? How do we get the millions out on the streets again? mean, we've done it before and we will do it again. And some of the material that Sophie was giving, that, you know, on the huge increase, particularly of the United States on our nuclear weapons development and I wouldn't say testing yet, because I think that's the one part that would give us an even real oomph to say the United States is testing nuclear weapons again. For God's sakes, what are they doing? Sometimes people don't take into account the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that are being used to redevelop, to reconstruct all of these nuclear weapons, which is what the United States is doing. I mean, we've created 2 new nuclear plants, and yet we can't get the American public mobilized on that. But if we say they're testing these things now, that may be our one hook that we can get them going. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Lindsey.
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, should we just care about ending wars, not who is doing it? Well, of course, I think all of us would like to see no war, and there's also a sense in which you can't always say kind of who started it. You know, that you see a build up to war and so on. But I think it's also very important that we have to oppose wars where we are. And to me, therefore, what I do is most importantly is to campaign against the British government, which there's plenty, as we all know, to campaign about when it comes to Britain. It had the biggest empire in the world. It still wants to hang on to this kind of, you know, this world important role, even though it's incapable of delivering, you know, quite basic things for the population in this country. But don't worry about that, build another aircraft carrier. You know, that's the kind of sentiment that goes on. So I think it is important to say that we're against all war, but also to say we will campaign. And I support the Russian anti-war campaigners. I mean, somebody who I've known for a number of years, Boris Kagalitsky, is actually somebody who suffered as an anti-war campaigner and is in prison. And I'm very much in favor of supporting those. But to me, the main thing we have to do is to campaign against our government and its allies. And that's why I think it's very important that we do obviously link up with people internationally, but we do say that's the central thing. Will Trump do anything for peace? I think the difficulty we've got here is that I don't think anybody should trust Trump in the slightest. And I think that, you know, there's plenty, even though it's interesting, if you look at the last period of office that he had from 2016, he didn't invade anywhere, which is quite a departure in recent times for an American president. So, you know, and people have said that to me. I mean, I've had people saying to me, you know, that's good, and that maybe he's got a different approach. It's also true that he did play a very, very bad role in the Middle East and moved the US embassy to Jerusalem. He also dropped the mother of all bombs on Afghanistan, you know, so let's not get too rosy a picture about Trump and his, you know, what he's done in the past and what he's capable of. I think that what he represents is a very different, you know, he's looking at the situation and he's saying, I want to, and let's face it, Trump wants to protect the interests of American imperialism and American capitalism. And he sees that what Biden has done is not doing that, is not protecting it. And that's why he's saying with Ukraine, we can settle with Russia, we can do all these kind of things. But of course, he's got quite a different position when it comes to China. And so obviously he's not talking about really de-escalating there. I mean, he's got, you know, Trump has got a different way, I think, of coming at these things. I also, when I spoke in my introduction, said that I do, you know, I think his election will boost the far right international, has boosted the far right internationally for obvious reasons. And I think his policies over against the Muslims, which is I mean, it's a phenomenon we have in this country, and I know in Germany and elsewhere and France, is a very, and is connected to the wars and to the imperialism. And personally, I mean, I think the whole attitude to refugees, although again Biden has been absolutely shocking on those, but with all of those, these aren't things which move you towards peace. They're things which move you towards division, right-wing politics, and potentially, you know, future wars in the case of the migrants, obviously, with or future conflict with countries in Central and Latin America. So those would be my answers to it.
Thank you, Lindsey. Sophie?
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of interesting one, isn't it, in terms of like what is Trump up to, and is he going to be playing a useful role in trying to sort of bring the conflict to an end in Ukraine? I mean, I feel very skeptical about it, because I feel that you know, understandably and rightly so, there's a massive sort of groundswell of like opposition to the war in Ukraine in the US. I think, you know, primarily it's driven by, you know, the huge amount of money that's being spent, you know, as opposed to and people's living standards. The points I think Anne was making, or was it Sevim, I think, in terms of like, you know, people's living standards in the States is really, really terrible. So, you know, it's kind of populist sort of thing kind of going on there. I mean, I think the other thing is that there, you know, the kind of different tactics being played out by different sections of the US in terms of like how they try to maintain their dominance in the world. And certainly it looks like what Trump is doing is trying to sort of split Russia away from China, you know, to sort of try and sort of placate Russia, and then really to sort of focus all sort of US economic and kind of military aggression on a confrontation with China. I mean, that certainly seems to be what you know, the Trump administration was incredibly aggressive towards China in its previous presidency. You know, really whipping up sort of hatred against China. You know, had all the stuff around COVID. You know, it was all, you know, it's the Chinese virus, all this sort of stuff. And now you've got like these massive sort of tariffs being, you know, put onto Chinese goods, and you know, not just Chinese goods, but sort of primarily. And I think that when you look at like you know, what the US has been doing in terms of the AUKUS treaty, you know, like for since Obama, it's been sort of moving all, you know, a huge amount of its sort of military hardware and you know, can speak on this to the Asia Pacific, and has been, you know, desperately trying to provoke, you know, conflict with countries in that region against China, precisely as people have said, like Lindsey, this is about the US trying to sort of maintain its dominance in a situation where other countries, particularly, you know, China, their economies are just much stronger, and other countries are wanting to kind of work in different ways and, you know, want to sort of cooperate economically with China. So I feel that's kind of what's going on. And I think, you know, that and this is, you know, again, something that Lindsey said in terms of what sort of peace could you get in Ukraine. It's very difficult to say, because you could have a situation where you've got kind of NATO troops that are kind of policing, you know, a sort of a border buffer zone in Ukraine. You know, as I said, you've got, you know, there's no evidence that Trump is going to pull these nuclear weapons out of Europe. We know that the US is planning to put long-range missiles into Germany. So you've got a very, very dangerous, like unstable, destabilizing sort of situation across Europe. So and you know, is Trump going to do anything about that? I don't think so. So I suppose that's kind of my view. I think ultimately, like, who stops wars? You know, it's like, it's sort of public protest, isn't it? You know, these sort of huge protests that we've been having around Palestine. Like, we haven't stopped it, but it's certainly like putting the spotlight on to the the genocide that's being carried out by Israel, and it's totally sort of politically isolated. But certainly historically, we've seen that when you've had a real sort of threat of you know, nuclear confrontation, Cuban Missile Crisis, and the sort of the 80s, the sort of the height of the sort of the Cold War, it was a role of like mass sort of public protests that actually sort of force those political leaders to kind of step back and also to disarm. So I do feel that, you know, ultimately it's our role in terms of pushing sort of political leaders to stop those wars. But I just feel like Trump's track record, and you know, like Anne was saying, the sort of the hawks that he's put into his administration, you know, make that sort of possibility of sort of peace, I think, like, you know, very, very hard. So yeah, it's just there'll be a huge amount of struggle kind of going on, certainly in relation to the points again that Lindsey and others were making around austerity, and you know, the huge pressure it's going to put on people's financial situation, and I think that will continue to be like a real sort of pressure for governments that continue to try and take this track of like increasing, you know, defence spending.
Thank you, Sophie. We'll come back to questions around movement building and alliance for protest building in the next, well, in the round after this. But I've got a group of 3 sort of questions, well, 4 actually, that I'm going to take together. And again, I'll paraphrase. 2 are from anonymous contributors, one of whom asks the panelists to say a bit more about NATO and its intentions and the role of the United States and Britain in NATO. And that's something that I know that both CND and the Stop the War Coalition are very, very clear on. Bruce asks a question about whether any of the panelists know the percentage of UK military expenditure in the US. I'm guessing that's quite a difficult question to answer precisely, but there will be things to say on the military and spending relationships between the US and the UK. Related to that, I guess, is another anonymous question about the ongoing series of demonstrations connected to the Palestine Solidarity movement around UK arms bases, and whether or not we should, as a broader peace and anti-war movement, be focusing on those. And there's a question from Ian Hewitt, which I've shortened quite drastically, but Ian makes some important points in the Q&A, if you have a look, about the use of Storm Shadow, the UK's missile system, which has been used from Ukrainian into Russian territory. And Ian asks about not just the supply of these, but the degree to which UK personnel, wherewithal, and intervention was used directly in the launching of those systems. So I'm going to do it in reverse order this time. So I'm going to come to Sophie first, then Lindsey, then Anne, if that's okay. So there are 4 questions there, but they cover similar territory, I feel.
Okay, well, I mean, firstly, in relation to the role of NATO and the US and the UK in that, I mean, certainly, like, CND has been opposed to NATO since 1960. You know, we recognise that long ago, the sort of deeply destabilizing role that NATO played, but also in terms of driving nuclear proliferation, in that you would have like this alliance, you would have countries that do not have nuclear weapons themselves, but would be have nuclear weapons stationed on their soil. So again, like, you know, a very, very sort of dangerous situation. And certainly, like, you know, we feel that the role that NATO, the aggressive and rapid expansion of NATO across Europe has hugely contributed to the sort of destabilization in Eastern Europe, and certainly in relation to Ukraine. And I think this attempt, you know, this huge pressure that's been put on Ukraine to join NATO has had a horrific sort of impact, I think, on that country and on the population. And I think that when you look at the role that NATO states have been playing, like you know, Britain, in terms of escalating this conflict, and the type of weaponry that they've sent to Ukraine, like for instance depleted uranium tipped munitions, which we know that when they explode, they create this sort of radioactive dust that, if it's inhaled or poisons the landscape, it causes sort of generational cancers. Like, why on earth would you send weapons like that into Ukraine if you care about the population of that country? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense at all. And certainly, the role that our previous kind of government played, like Boris Johnson, flew out to Turkey to sabotage the peace talks that were taking place in March 2022 with Ukraine and Russia, precisely on the issue of NATO membership. Ukraine were talking about, yes, we want to have negotiations. We're happy to sort of like, for NATO membership to be sort of taken off the table. And Boris Johnson went in and said that couldn't possibly be the case. So I think that Britain's played an absolutely appalling role in this conflict, and as I say, now continues to play this very sort of aggressive and hawkish role within NATO, really pushing the escalation and also kind of pushing the increase in spending. So C&D's view is that NATO plays no positive role in Europe. It's not a defensive institution. It is an aggressive alliance, a nuclear armed alliance, and it should be disbanded. It should have been disbanded like at the end of the Cold War when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded. NATO should have been disbanded, but instead it aggressively expanded eastwards. So yeah, that's what we think on that. In terms of like presence on military bases, yes, completely. I think it's really, really important to do that. Certainly C&D's got a tour of bases in 2025. We're going to be going to Barrow-in-Furness, where Britain's nuclear submarines are built, but also, it's a BAE Systems factory, but it's also to sort of draw the links between, sort of British factories and British bases here and their role in the genocide that's taking place in Palestine, and also as part of the kind of the wider sort of US war drive. So, I think that, the British government has made it absolutely clear it wants to keep all these bases secret. It doesn't want anybody anywhere near them. So, it's really, really important that we shine a spotlight on these bases. And for those people who are, brave and committed enough to sort of, do non-violent direct action to sort of stop those bases from functioning. I mean, that's really, really incredible, very, very important work. And there's a very long tradition of carrying out that sort of action where it's arrestable actions, but people are doing it because they're trying to stop a greater crime. Is really, really important, and very a strong tradition in Britain. Greenham Common, but going further back than that. So I think absolutely critical that people are involved in that. And then in terms of the Storm Shadow missiles, I mean, my understanding is that that sort of Ukrainian forces would have been trained by British military in terms of how to use those. But I don't know, like, if there's that's still the case. You've got British forces in there now. Maybe someone else will know better than me.
Thank you, Sophie. Lindsey.
Yeah, just on to follow on what Sophie said about the end of the Cold War, and that NATO should have disbanded then. I think that when you look at NATO, and I agree very much with what she says about the early years of NATO, but this expansion has been very, very damaging, in my view, to the whole of Europe. I think it's very much tied into wider political questions. I think it leads to a lack of democracy in some countries who are told they have to sign up to NATO, they have to sign up to the EU, they have to sign up to all these things, which is a kind of package which is decided for them by the biggest powers in Europe rather than what they might actually want. I think the fact that Sweden and Finland joined NATO in the last year or so has been also extremely damaging. And of course, now what do we have? We have in Germany, they're announcing where all the underground bunkers are so people can go and find them. In other words, you know, creating this sort of situation where they see immediate enemies, whether it's Russia or wherever else it is. In Sweden, the whole of the population has been issued with a sort of protect and survive pamphlet of the sort the older of us among the audience can remember from when the Brits did this in the 80s. I mean, these are, you know, this is building up the pressure towards war. It's making people think that war is likely. It's making people think that nuclear war may not be desirable, but is certainly possible. And I think that those are very dangerous things. It's also a driver, and we should be aware that it's not just a military force, it's a political force, and it plays a very important political role, as we've seen with Mark Rutte this week, increasing the level of arms spending, or wanting to increase the level of arms spending. Obviously, the United States and Britain play a very big role in this. And they've been very, very keen. And we should look, for example, at Ukraine. It's not just that NATO has been involved in the recent war in Ukraine, where it clearly is a proxy war between NATO and Russia, but Ukrainian troops have been used for years under NATO command, for example, in Afghanistan. And this goes back, what, 15 or so years. In other words, there's been a process of sort of incorporating Ukraine and various other countries into NATO's operations. And the operations themselves, I think, have been very damaging. I think in Ukraine, it's obviously very damaging, but in Afghanistan, if you look in Libya, you look at all these things, and I think you have to say that NATO has played a very negative role, and it should be disbanded. And the fact that it's expanding at such a rate into the Pacific, into the whole of Europe, right up to the Russian border, is something which has led to the instability that we've got. I don't know the percentage of UK spending on US arms, but it's considerable, because a lot of the arms that are British arms are actually produced in the United States, including some of the Trident missile system. And you know, what lots of people say is, when in this country everyone says, oh, we need more arms spending because it protects jobs, actually a lot of the jobs will be in the United States rather than in Britain, which nowhere near all the arms spending goes towards jobs there. So that's just, I mean, maybe Anne knows more about the exact figures, but it's considerable. The question about the Palestine and the demos at arms factories, I think my view is it's foolish, really, to counterpose all the different sorts of activity that people do. And, you know, there's a whole number of people, we know Palestine Action and so on, whose main activity is going to Elbit factories, sometimes, you know, preventing them from operating and so on. And they've been relatively successful at doing some of those things. I still feel that the national demonstrations that we have are the key, firstly, to building a coherent movement around the country. And secondly, if you think we have loads of people who say to us from the Middle East that people see these demonstrations and it inspires them. But also in terms of putting any pressure on politics here in Britain, I think they have been absolutely central. So I think we should see it all as, okay, you know, people have different things that they want to get involved in. There's different priorities that people have in the anti-war and peace movement, and so it should be. The demonstrations tend to bring them all together, and I think without those, the movement would be much, much weaker. That's just my kind of opinion on it. And then the final question, which is on Storm Shadow. As I understand it, not only of the British they train Ukrainian military personnel in this country as well as in Ukraine. Quite considerable numbers of Ukrainian troops have been trained here. But my understanding is that also they cannot fire these missiles without at least some British military input into it in terms of the targeting and where these missiles are going to. So I think there is a very close relationship, and I have to say that I think there's absolutely no doubt. You know, they always say, I mean, it makes me, well, it doesn't make me laugh really, but I find it ironic that on the one hand, Putin is the biggest threat to world peace, and he's going to invade absolutely everywhere, and he'll be in Dunkirk in 2 weeks if we don't stop him. And then as soon as you say, well, what about if he responds to these missiles being fired into Russia, then everybody goes, oh, he's not going to do that. That's just bluff. He won't do anything like that. Now, he hasn't so far done that, but I think we have to be aware that that is a possibility. And I have to say, if that happens, and I think Britain will be a major target. I mean, I'm not just talking obviously about the threat of complete nuclear war, which would be a disaster for humanity, not least in this country, but also various other, you know, the talks about cyber attacks and other sorts of attacks. I'm sure Britain will be a major target because it is identified as a major protagonist in this proxy war.
Thank you, Lindsey. Anne?
Well, I've just looked up, Googled how much money the UK spends on purchasing US weapons. And one of the websites says around 500 million from, I think it was 2003. But there are plenty of websites that have how much the US sells to countries of the world. And it's a lot. That's our biggest export here in the United States, it seems. Not peaceful things, but war machine things, which is a real tragedy for our whole country. A couple of other things I would just mention. You know, the U.S. and the Bush administration, back after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and supposedly not supposedly, the agreement that the Bush administration had with Gorbachev that the West would not poach any of the Warsaw Pact countries into NATO. Of course, that's been well documented that the Bush administration and NATO lied on that. I would totally agree with what the recent acquisition of countries of Sweden and Finland have been so destabilizing really to those countries and the people in those countries, and the numbers of groups that have tried to protest what their governments did because of the huge increase in the amount of spending that they now have to put into their military budget. The question of what can we do? How can we highlight what's going on here? I love this idea of the C&D tour of UK bases, and I think we need to reestablish in the US and maybe Veterans for Peace. We can get Veterans for Peace to have in 2025 the tour of US bases too. And I would mention that, you know, we'd still have people that are doing plowshares actions of going on to military bases that have nuclear weapons. In fact, there are 2 women that are still in German jail from having cut a fence at the Buchel Air Base. And one of our other activists from the U.S. who was involved in cutting the fence has just been notified by the German courts that he needs to appear in February to go into jail for his 15 days of penalty for challenging nuclear weapons. So the issue of citizen activism and whether it is in huge mobilizations, which are tremendous to really give a push to the governments of our nations, that we are opposed to this, or whether it's the slow movement in individual communities of going into the Elbit facilities, which British activists have done so very well, and where we now have 4 young women who went into an Elbit facility in New Hampshire, and they're now in jail for 60 days. So the U.S. justice system looks a little, or injustice system looks a little bit differently on occupation of some of these weapons manufacturers, but I think we definitely need to buck it all up. And I thank you all very much for all of the information that we can use here in the United States to light a fire under everybody on the whole issue of the potential for, for nuclear war. And we did have in Washington last weekend at the National Press Club, we had a panel on the dangers that we face right now. And I can put a link into well, I guess we don't have a chat, but we could send it out in the post information we send after the webinar. But we have had people that have been coming through to go to individual members of the U.S. Congress to say something's got to happen here. We're so close to a real nuclear exchange. So we in the U.S. are not unaware of it for sure, and trying to put pressure where we can. So thank you all very much for this opportunity to be with you. Thank you.
Brilliant, Anne. Thank you very much. You preempted sort of my closing questions. We are overrunning, and clearly we could have gone on for a bit longer, taking all of the questions and responses. But just to sum up then, because Anne's touched on some of the aspects of this last round and the sort of things I want to hear in summing up, I'm going to ask Lindsey and then Sophie to come back just on these points. There were very many questions in the chat, but Dennis asks, how can we bring about massive protests in every corner of both sides of the Atlantic? Is it buck it up or ruck it up? Anne said, bring the ruckus is another phrase an American phrase I've heard, and we very much need to do that. And Linda asked a similar question about unity with the climate movement. Caroline asks about building a massive broad church, and particularly to Sophie, Leslie, who's probably in this photograph behind me here, asks for a bit more information about what's happening with Lakenheath Action for Peace and plans around that base and why we're doing it. But these will be the last responses, first from Lindsey and then from Sophie. Thanks, Lindsey.
Okay, well, just very, very briefly on that. I mean, you have to do the work, and you have to, even if it's a small number of people, you've got to convince. We have to try and convince a small number of people. They in turn convince bigger numbers of people. We've been doing this for a number of years now over Palestine, and the effects with the Gaza protests has been immense. And now we have, we say, oh, it's only 100,000 on that demo, as if that's a small thing, whereas it's the biggest demonstrations that take place all year, So now we haven't got that same situation with Ukraine or over China, which is obviously a more remote sense that people have about when that could happen. We've got to try and educate, agitate, organize is the slogan, isn't it? That we've got to do all those things. If it's small meetings we have, that is very valuable. But it's always a question of how do you get out and how do you get more people? We've got to take it into the trade unions much more than we have. And we have a problem with some of the trade unions over sending arms to Ukraine, particularly the unions that represent workers in the arms industry who are not good on these questions of war and peace. But we have to do it. And people always think you're never going to get anywhere, but we do get somewhere. And we must always remember how much a difference we have made in all of these wars and in all of the things that we do. And people, everyone gets the sense where you feel, are we achieving anything? What are we doing? Just think, if you didn't have a protest movement, if you didn't have CND and Stop the War, if you didn't have all those sorts of things, they would have a completely free hand to go ahead and do all these things. So those are my feelings on it. And yes, it means linking with the climate movement, because that is, if we didn't have the military and we didn't have wars, there'd still be problems with climate, but they would be a lot less than they are now. And the environmental destruction of war is absolutely huge. So yeah, we have to do all those things. And just finally to say thank you very much for organizing, and thanks so much to, particularly to hear Anne and Sevim. It's really, really good to hear from people internationally, and just to everybody, have a good Christmas break and Happy New Year. And then we need to get organizing. And the next Palestine demonstration's on 18th of January in London. So if we don't see each other before then, we'll see each other there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Lindsey. Sophie.
Yeah, just to echo those points. Yeah, thank you so much to everybody for participating in this webinar, and yeah, thanks to Anne and Sevim and Lindsey. So I mean, yeah, this is always like the sort of the hardest question, isn't it? Like, what do we do, and how do we kind of mobilize people? And we are, you know, things like this are part of all of that, isn't it? It's kind of having that discussion, being understanding the kind of the dynamics that are going on when we're confronted by, you know, all this huge amount of kind of information through the mainstream media or what have you. So it's understanding sort of the political dynamics to really be able to work out what's the most effective use of our time and how we kind of campaign. And I think certainly, you know, what CND is doing, we've always done this, but we're trying to do this more and more, is like, because the situation is becoming more and more stark, the interconnectedness of our issues is becoming more and more clear. So in terms of, you know, the sort of threat around climate chaos is completely interlinked with, you know, the threat of nuclear war and militarism. And so we want to work really closely with the climate movement around this to show that, you know, these issues are completely interlinked. If you get rid of sort of militarism, that will massively decrease carbon emissions and help save the planet. And it's sort of about providing sort of solutions for all those different alliances so that we're all strengthened by it. But certainly, like, engaging with people where they're at. So I think the issue around austerity, as people have been saying, is absolutely critical. So for me, you know, it's very much about showing the absolute obscene, obscene like cost of nuclear weapons and how it's such a drain on public finances. I mean, you know, literally it's hundreds of billions of pounds. There's no scrutiny, there's no accountability. You know, the MOD is just, you know, overspending, and it's just, that's fine, that's just another 10 billion. So it's exposing that and showing how, you know, that money, if it's invested into other sections of the economy, like you know, green jobs, but also in relation to like social care, for instance, you know, it could be creating like, you know, hundreds of millions of jobs and freeing people up to get back into the workplace, you know, and making a massive difference to people's lives. So it's about kind of coming up with solutions where we're just sort of faced with this sort of, you know, there's no other way but kind of militarism. I think being creative, having a sense of humor. We find that doing sort of stunts like we did, you know, when we went to Lakenheath, and I'll talk about Lakenheath in a minute, you know, we sort of made these kind of missiles, and we had people sort of, you know, dressed up as Trump and Kamala Harris and Biden, you know, making the real point, like serious political point about, you know, US nuclear weapons being brought to Britain, but also, you know, showing that you can kind of have fun. It's another way kind of engaging with people, and sometimes kind of breaking down what can seem a very, you know, too serious issue, or so making it kind of accessible. So I think that's very important. I think all, you know, all the work around building social media across all the platforms, working really hard about kind of developing video content is becoming more and more important. Social media, you know, has been the massive challenge to mainstream media, and it's how people get so much of their news and organise. So it's really important for us to be part of that. Then finally, in terms of what's going on at Lakenheath, so Lakenheath Alliance for Peace recently kind of set up, it's, you know, it's got 40-50 organisations as part of that. It's all about bringing people to Lakenheath, where it's, you know, the military base where these US nuclear weapons are going to be coming. The 14th to the 25th of April is going to be a peace camp. But also as part of that, there's going to be an international conference, which is on the 24th of April. That's Thursday, the 24th. That's bringing people from South Korea, from Japan, from the States, from across Europe, coming together to talk about you know, these sort of issues, the international dynamics, and it's all sort of happening at Lakenheath. So and then finally there's going to be a kind of blockade on Saturday the 26th of April. CND's really mobilizing for that, and that again, you know, come along if you haven't been to that base before. We'll be doing tours, so you can actually have a look and get your head around, like, what does this base do, how does it fit in with everything else, and if you want to, you can take part in a sit-down protest. So there's lots going on. If you look at the CND website or the Lakenheath Alliance for Peace website, you can get more information. But you know, get involved. Whatever you do is definitely working towards our long goal of nuclear-free, sustainable, peaceful world.
Huge thanks, Sophie. Also thanks to Lindsey, to Sevim, and to Anne for this really important meeting. I feel we could have gone on for a lot longer, and I'm afraid that given the dynamics of what is going on in the world, we will be meeting like this again, not just in Zoom meetings, but on stalls, at small protests, at direct action events, at protests outside of bases, and at huge mobilisations in London, national demonstrations against the ongoing genocide on the Palestinian people and possibly other things. The world is an incredibly dangerous place. As I said earlier, we are living through a time of acute nuclear risks, but also of war, genocide, and rapidly shifting global dynamics. And set in stone now, not just in the United States, but across Europe, significant changes are about to come about. And with those significant political changes, there are significant global risks embedded in them. And one of the benefits of being in the United Kingdom, you know, despite the UK's role in the world, is that we do have a united, very well organised peace and anti-war movement. We have the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, we have the Stop the War Coalition, and many other organisations. So anybody still left on this chat, on this webinar, who is not yet a member of both of those organisations, do join. Register your interest, sign up the email lists, go along to your local meetings and get involved, and then bring 10 other people with you, because the situation is acutely dangerous and we need very many more of us working on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis to make sure that our resistance to these risks, our resistance to the war drive, to militarism and to nuclear risks is as powerful as possible. So get some rest if and when you can. Keep an eye out on all of the social media and the messages from CND Stop the War and elsewhere, and get ready for the fight of our lives in January 2025, because I feel that's where we're headed. But thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you too. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
It's for the world.